So Darren is here helping me out tonight. This is the first time I've run a webinar before, so bear with me. Tonight's webinar is brought to you by the Gippsland Community Power Hub, which is funded by Sustainability Victoria and hosted by the Gippsland Climate Change Network in partnership with the Energy Innovation Cooperative and the Mallacoota Sustainable Energy Group. So just a couple of housekeeping things to begin with. If I can get that there. So tonight's session is a webinar, so your video and audio are off, so we can't see or hear you. If you would like to ask questions, just use the Q&A icon at the bottom there, and at the end of the presentations, we'll bring the speakers back together to answer your questions. If you're having any technical problems, just use the chat icon and we'll do the best to help you out. I'm actually presenting from the Poowong Basketball Stadium today for a couple of reasons. The internet here is better than it is at my home, and I had to bring my daughter into play. So hopefully there isn't too much distracting noise tonight. I think it's pretty quiet actually with the headphones on and doors shut, so it wouldn't be too bad. I'd also like to acknowledge that the traditional custodians of the land where I am tonight are the Bunurong people. So I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the lands from which you are joining us tonight and all Aboriginal peoples. Please feel free to use the chat icon to name the traditional custodians of your location. I also acknowledge that we live, work and play on the lands and waters of the world's oldest and most sustainable culture. I acknowledge the invaluable contributions of the First Nations people to our understanding of climate change and the environment, and in protecting our places of play for generations to come. This beautiful painting by Bunurong artist John Winch was produced to celebrate the Memorandum of Understanding between the Bunurong Land Council Aboriginal Corporation and the West Gippsland Catchment Management Authority, and represents the Tarwin and Powlett rivers coming down from the mountains and Bunjil the wedge-tailed eagle watching over them. The shapes at the base of the rivers depicts people coming together to talk and work on country, which I think beautifully reflects the intentions of tonight's gathering to share knowledge and empower local communities to protect the places where we come to play. I also wanted to share that in preparing for this webinar, I discovered that Aussie Rules football, a game that so many of us love, is believed to have origins from the First Nations game Margrook, which was played with a possum skin ball. So I wonder if there's actually many other games that can be traced back to First Nations peoples. And I'd like to thank Mandy Leggett from the West Gippsland CMA, who is the Cultural Heritage Officer there, for giving me permission to use those images tonight. Now, I'm really excited to hear from our speakers tonight, who are going to help us understand why our sports clubs should care about climate change and what actions they can take, as well as how to go about it and other benefits they might experience. Now, our first speaker is John Clark. John Clark currently leads the regional projections team within the CSIRO Climate Science Centre, where he has worked for the past 12 years. He brings a range of experience from previous roles in the Australian media, biodiversity, conservation sectors, and has over 30 years experience doing, teaching and communicating science nationally and internationally. His expertise lies in developing applicable, fit-for-purpose, scientifically robust climate projections and helping people understand and use them. John recently led the Victorian Climate Projections 2019 project, which included developing a new suite of high-resolution modelling and had a strong focus on assisting users to make sense of the abundance of the data. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, John, and hopefully you do a bit of a better job than I did.
Thanks very much, Tammy. Right, can I steal presentation from you? Looks like I can. You getting that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. This is going to be fairly quick and dirty, I'm afraid, because we only have 10 minutes. We could talk all day on these topics, so I'll try and resist that temptation. I'm going to focus in on a couple of particular aspects of the future climate for the region, particularly heat and smoke. But I want to start with just a tiny bit of background. Firstly, how well do we understand the climate system? It's an incredibly complex and highly interactive and interacting system, but our understanding of it is pretty good and goes back quite a long way, but our understanding is imperfect. But because of the advanced understanding we do have, most of these processes that are depicted in this picture can be turned into mathematical equations. So, you know, if this is how you see the world when you look out the window, with or without the rabbit, this is how a climate modeler sees it. A whole bunch of differential equations that can be solved on massive supercomputers, and that's what we do. It's incredibly computationally expensive, so only rich countries can afford to do it, but there are about 20 or so research institutions around the world who do, and collectively there are lots of models that we pull together and analyze the results from. The next thing I just want to touch on is what is it we're talking about? I'm going to be speaking specifically about climate scale projections of climate change. So if we step back to here to get our understanding all on the same page around this, you'll hear that everyone's familiar with the term weather. This is what we talk about every day, and this is what the Bureau of Meteorology provides us forecasts for every day, and they describe the conditions of the atmosphere at a particular place and time. And they tend to be talking about hours to days, and weather forecasts just tend to go out, 7 or so days into the future, and that's about it. Another term that you will hear sometimes is climate variability. This is the natural variation in the climate that occurs on timescales of months, seasons, and years. Things like the El Nino Southern Oscillation is a classic example of natural climate variability. And we understand that some summers are hotter and drier than other summers as a consequence of this natural variability. Climate is what we mean by when we average up this weather information over, let's say, 30 years. 30 years is the international standard for assessing the mean state of climate based on detailed weather observations. So when we're talking about climate, we're talking about multi-decadal. So when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about changes at that climate timescale, so decades to centuries. So the information I'll show you today, this evening, is really out to the middle of this century. So looking a fair way into the future, really. And just really quickly, this is how a climate model is kind of constructed. It's like an onion, a whole bunch of boxes layered on top of each other up into the atmosphere and down to the depths of the ocean. And the supercomputers solve those differential equations in every grid box simultaneously, and then step through time to produce time series of realistic climate information. And that's about all we've got time for on that. But how do we develop climate change projections? The first thing is that knowledge that we've just briefly looked at. Some understanding of what the future might look like in terms of economy, industry, transport, energy production, the things that influence the greenhouse gases that end up in the atmosphere. We can't know those things, so we have to do scenario type planning for those future situations. Then we plug it all into the global climate models, and then we can produce climate change projections. So I mentioned timescales. Thinking about timeframes is really important because, as I said, these climate projections are done at that climate scale. We're not in the business of projecting weather in the long term, although there's a bit of a caveat to that. So I thought it's useful to have a look at this graphic, which sort of shows that I'm imagining that this is my grandson who was actually born this year. So by the time period that I'm talking about, where I'll be giving you some numbers shortly, around the 2050s, we're talking about a child born in the 20s becoming a parent, a young parent by around that time. So these are absolutely realistic timeframes for our communities. And just up the top here, I've stolen this graphic from thismobjunkie.com. And I don't really understand how they've put these numbers together, but this number I put there, that's the amount of warming, the average warming across all of Australia since the pre-industrial time. So you can see we've already warmed by nearly 1.5 degrees in Australia. Okay, this is the stuff that Tammy mentioned, the Victorian Climate Projections 2019, where we did a whole bunch of new modelling, and most of the results that I'm going to show you this evening come from here. So what's been happening? We know that because the planet and the atmosphere around the planet is warming, we would expect more hot extremes. That is just a simple conclusion to draw. If you've got a hotter atmosphere, you would also expect those hot days to get hotter. That's borne out in the observations, as you can see in this graph here. What this shows you is the number of the amount of time in a year when the daily maximum temperature has been in the top 10% of days throughout the historic record. And you can see that, notwithstanding this one back early, there's generally a gradual increase, and then since 2000 it's really spiked. We've started to get a dramatic increase in the number of hot days occurring, and this is averaged across all of Victoria. So there's the warming of the atmosphere. There's also changes to the synoptic systems that drive weather, and they can have effects like prolonging heat waves that would have occurred naturally anyway, might be longer because of some of the changes in synoptic processes. And so, as I've said, we know from the observations that we've seen these sorts of increases. Most of the climate projections, including those that we did for the Victorian Climate Projections work, show that this type of increase is going to continue. So that poses problems for sport. Things like, when do you stop playing a sport if you're in a stadium or if you're outdoors? And factors like things that we don't always understand. There's this thing called black globe temperature, which is supposed to better represent how hot a person might feel if they're actually standing out in the sun and doing some physical activity. And they can be substantially hotter than the corresponding shade temperatures, the sort of temperatures that might be forecast by the Bureau on a given day. So these things are important to think about. So thanks to Tammy, I was able to dig into some of the policies around sport in the region. Basketball, for example, the policy says that at 35 degrees Celsius, and they take readings actually at courtside, then implementation of mitigation strategies is to start. So that's things like just taking more breaks during play. But if it reaches 40 degrees C at courtside, then play stops. In the bowls policy, 36 degrees is an important threshold for them. So what I've done is I've focused in on two of those measures, the 36-degree day and the 40-degree day. Where these data come from is from those Victorian climate projections that we did, which are at a 5 kilometre spatial resolution, so grid boxes of 5 kilometres by 5 kilometres across the whole state. We're able to take the projected changes from the models and apply those changes to real-world observations from the Bureau of Meteorology to produce what have the appearance of real weather as they might play out under the new climate of the future. So what I've done here is I've pulled out some data for Korumburra and Poowong for days greater than 36 degrees Celsius and days greater than 40. For the 2030s and 2050s, actually, sorry, there's an error in my title, 2030s, so that's a 30-year period centered on 2030, and the 2050s, again, a 30-year period centered on 2050s. For the 2030s, I've just looked at high emissions. We haven't talked much about emissions, but around the 2030s, it doesn't really matter which emissions pathway we follow. So, but by the 2050s, it does make a difference. So we need to consider more than one emission scenario. And for the Victorian climate projections work, we have 2 emission scenarios for which data were produced, medium and a high. So you can see, I won't go through all of the numbers, but you can see that we're looking at increases sometimes really quite substantial increases in both the number of days above 36 around the 2030s, more again by the 2050s. And if we look at days greater than 40, we're going from potentially a fairly rare event. So this means that on average, in that period, 0.2 days per year. So in other words, 2 days in 10 that would exceed 40 degrees Celsius. And that's going up to at least 1 day a year at the upper end of the range of projections, or up to 2.7 under high emissions at the sort of worst case end of those projections under high emissions. Similarly for Poowong, even though these towns are not very far apart, they're actually quite different in terms of the data. It'd be really interesting to hear if that's the lived experience by the locals as well, but that's certainly what the data show. Okay, that's temperature. So it's going to get hotter. You're going to hit those temperature thresholds for sport more frequently. The other parameter that can be really important for smoke, as we all will remember from a couple of summers ago, is air quality. People were absolutely gobsmacked by the extent of the smoke coverage across Victoria in the 2019-20 bushfires, and the air quality index just went berserk. You know, hazardous levels were hit for Churchill, Morwell, Traralgon, really not very nice, and certainly not the sort of weather you want to be running around and having to breathe a lot of air in. I'm not going to give you projections of air quality though. We don't have that, but I can talk about changes in fire danger. So because we work in the climate space, I can talk about the weather parameters that are conducive to fires, but I can't really tell you much about the actual incidence of fires. But we do know from lots of detailed analysis that fire weather has become more dangerous since the 1900s. This will be your lived experience too, I'm sure. Fire seasons have become longer and they're starting earlier. We're now getting our fire seasons overlapping with the fire seasons in the Northern Hemisphere, which is posing major issues for us because we used to be able to swap equipment. Those aerial water bombers, for example, we used to be able to swap those, share them. So when the Northern Hemisphere didn't need them, we would, and vice versa, but now we both need them at the same time at certain times of year. All of the evidence indicates that those trends will continue. And so when we've done some analyses for towns in Gippsland, I only have data for Bairnsdale, but the number of days where the Forest Fire Danger Index, so that's the index that the Bureau use when they issue fire weather warnings. So the number of days above the 95th percentile. So that means that in the past, that 5% of days only would reach this threshold. So those days are likely to increase by 5 to 6 days a year by the middle of the century under high emissions. That's a big increase. That's a 32% increase. Now, if that translates into fires, so there's an ignition and there's enough fuel to burn, then we'll have an increase in the number of fires. If you want to know more about that, that comes from the Bureau. And that's me. Sorry, Tammy, did you tell me I was out of time?
I did. Good timing, well done.
Thanks.
Thank
okay,
you
I'll
very
let you
much.
have the screen back.
Thank you. And I'll try and share my screen again. Or actually, maybe it looks like I can go straight over. This will stop sharing screen. Do you want to continue? Let me see what I can do here. Okay. Give Sheila a proper introduction here. Okay, so yes, thank you, John. And next up we have Sheila Nguyen, and I hope I've said that right, Sheila. Sheila was recognised as an Australian Financial Review Top 100 Women of Influence for her leadership in galvanising the sport industry to protect and respect the natural environment. She is leading sport a leading sport and regenerative researcher and an energy and environmental design build environment practitioner who has consulted with several national sport organisations and professional clubs globally on strategic and operational sustainability issues. Sheila has produced over 50 internationally peer-reviewed research outputs, contributed to various media outlets such as the New York Times, The Age, The Australian, has been an invited speaker for TEDx in 2015 and presented at a number of environment and sport industry forums, most notably at COP21 in Paris 2015. The first time sport has been invited to the climate agreement discussions. Sheila was the invited chairperson and MC for the Sustainable Innovations in Sport Forum in Amsterdam, and was the co-MC and chairwoman for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Sport for Climate Action Framework Signatories Forum Sport Positive in 2020. Sheila is on a number of boards and advisory committees, including as an independent director on the World Lacrosse Sustainability Committee. Sheila is the CEO of the Sports Environment Alliance, the coalition of sport and planet leaders in Australia and New Zealand, working to protect the places where we play so we can continue to do what we love, watch and play sport. Over to you now, Sheila. Thank you.
Okay, there's lots of things I have to press to get onto the screen, but thank you for that really long introduction. I appreciate it. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's really an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. And John, I love that reference you made to the onion. I will be definitely using that in the future. I'd also like to thank Tammy Logan from the Gippsland Community Power Hub for inviting me, and look forward to answering any questions that you guys have at the end, but I'm going to be under strict advice to keep this to 10 minutes. So I might speak quickly, but if you have any questions later on, please let me know. I always like to start by just bringing us back to why Australia is so special and why we should be protecting this natural world that we live in. It's home to more than 80% of the plants, mammals, frogs, reptiles found only here in Australia. It's also obviously home to a very precious global natural treasure that is the Great Barrier Reef. And if you guys follow Mike Sheehan, who's an AFL journalist, he wrote about the importance of protecting the Great Barrier Reef in 2015, which I thought took a lot of courage for him to do so. The Alan Joneses of the world, of course, told him to piss off, but I think it was very brave of him to actually talk about it. And as well, Australia is home to 24,000 native plant species. And just to give you kind of unfair comparison, although we play sport against England, is that they only have 1,000, so we win. And I think, of course, you would agree this is a very, very special place where we live, but also it's arguably one of the best places in the world to play sport. If you look at the blue skies that we get to live under, and as well the endless coastlines where you guys live nearby, for some of you in Gippsland, but as well, you know, green grass everywhere. If you looked at a GPS of all the sport facilities that we have, you would see that they're in and around all the natural assets that we have that are blue, that are white, like snow, and as well green. But of course, these places are under incredible duress. John outlined the climate change effect that it's having on us here in Australia. And I always share my personal experience here in 2007 when I arrived from America. We were in the middle of millennium drought, and I remember sport being moved or canceled because of grounds being unplayable, hardened because of drought. And only a few years later in 2010, Queensland was under floods, displacing many thousands of people. You know, some of you might know that Suncorp Stadium then redeveloped to be more flood resilient. And then, of course, John touched upon the bushfires more recently, you know, Australia literally on fire, and as well alluded to air quality issues. And this is something that I know, working with the sport industry, Cricket Australia took a leadership role in giving some sort of standard in terms of air quality measurements, because of course, state by state, there were different ways of evaluating what is safe and what isn't safe. And, you know, this is having an incredible effect across the board for us in our communities. And I don't need to explain that to you. If you're working in and around sport, you would know that. Even in indoor sports, I know, Tammy, you're in a basketball court. Over when this was happening in Sydney, there was smog that came into one of the basketball courts, and they had to cancel one of the professional teams because of the ventilation. There wasn't a strong enough seal, and therefore they were being affected indoors. But we think about the places where we play are being affected, and you think about the hardened grounds that I mentioned earlier, but as well, you just look at things like the assets themselves, the facilities, the places where we're playing are either flooded, drought. All of those things are causing and wreaking havoc on the longevity of those assets, the safety of those assets. And as well, then you think about the people who are playing and exposed, and especially the vulnerable. If you're looking at children and the elderly in sports that are outdoors, for a lot of the time. Think about cricket, for example. There is a report that was released a couple of years ago called Hit for Six, and it talks and outlines all the physiological effects that extreme heat have on outdoor sports in particular. And then, of course, you think about organizations, and the organizations. John outlined some policies that basketball and bowls had rolled out, but of course, if sports at community all the way up to elite isn't responding to what is ultimately inevitable, then we are going to be a laggard in this space, but as well, to some extent, irresponsible and to some even negligent. So of course, climate change is affecting us in the community in and around, but the good thing is that we can be part of the solution. When we asked Layne Beachley a couple of years ago about how she would like to see sport respond to climate challenges, she said, we can acknowledge the fact we were part of the problem, but more importantly, we should be focusing on what kinds of solutions. And that's what we're really talking about tonight. And that's what the Gippsland Power Hub is doing, is creating solutions and assisting sport and other communities to participate actively in what is basically respect for our natural world. So how does sport participate in this discussion? Well, in the world, there's a lot going on, what we call basically the race to zero. Tammy mentioned in the intro that I'm involved with the UNFCCC Sport for Climate Action Framework, which is a mouthful, but essentially, that is a framework that was released in COP in 2018 that outlines principles that sports and sports signatories can follow. And this year, they've just made a recent announcement in the last month that they're actually being more aggressive with their ambitions because of COP and the discussions they've had there. And so now the sport industry is now targeting by 2040 net zero emissions, and by 2030 50% reduction in emissions. And it sounds like something quite big. For a community club, it's something that is very doable, as long as you're thinking about some of these ideas that I'm about to present in a way that can be applied in community level. So when I showcase some of these examples, they are for major or larger scale venues and organizations, but the principles are the same. If you think about water, it's reducing water. If it's about energy, it's reducing energy and thinking about things differently. So I hope that you can try to find a way that you can integrate some of that thinking into what you're doing where you are. And of course, work with collaborators like the Gippsland Power Hub, and also your LGAs who do have support and expertise that can weigh in. But some of the areas, the framework, as mentioned before, stadiums of tomorrow, meaning looking at your places of play and identifying opportunities to maximize its potential optimally. You have rooftop space for some of your venues. You've got, natural biodiversity in and around. There's lots of different things you can think about. And then lastly, and probably one of the bigger ways, especially if you're at a higher level of sport, is that idea of influence. Although community sport has so much influence, you are the heart and soul for many of your communities, and they look to you to set standards that are our ideals, in the way we behave across a number of social issues. So the way we think about these issues is broken down into these areas. So in terms of resources, how can you look at resources differently so you can either refuse them, reduce them, eliminate them, make them better, make more of them, as well as regeneration. So thinking about the biodiversity footprint, for example, some examples for resources are things like the Waste Management Phoenix Open, which is a golf tournament. They tout big numbers. So they say over 7 days, 20,000 people go through these gates for our tournament and create zero waste. So we're thinking about zero waste, for example. Regeneration, Wimbledon has an overlay of their operational plan, which is a biodiversity plan. So they think about, is there a way that we can put bird boxes around here or an apiary on site? Roland Garros has that, for example, but community clubs can do the same. I know some community bowls clubs who do have, for example, solar, but as well things like, their own community garden. And the other one is relationships. That is using your voice and your connections and your network to share the things that you are doing from a physical infrastructure or just the way that you operate, for example. And I'll focus on just two main examples of energy, and then I'll wrap things up. So the Melbourne Cricket Ground, among all other things that they do, which is fantastic, water recycling plant and food to secondary markets, they have LED lights that they've installed into these iconic lights that we think about when we think about the MCG, that are at a spec nowadays that are usable for broadcasting, for example. And then of course Amsterdam, this is actually for Arsenal Football Club. They have a big Tesla battery that powers their games. But what's even more impressive is at Amsterdam Arena, which I was lucky enough to see in person, was they had a mega battery, 148 Nissan Leaf batteries put into one, powers the stadium, as well as acts as a charging station, as well as powers into the community. So these are just only tip of the iceberg ideas. I know for a fact Tammy and her team would have tons of other ideas. I'm happy to answer some questions. I know you guys have the Lucknow Football Club who's done the battery installation, fantastic. But leaving you with one thought, there is a study that was just released by the Australian Conservation Foundation and the University of Tasmania, Powering a Sporting Nation, University of New South Wales. And it just says that with all the energy that could be saved and the money saved from energy generation from clean energy sources, community clubs would have to cook 2.5 million sausages to raise the same amount of money to help grow the game. It's something to leave you with as a thought, and as well, resource for you. The Sports Environment Alliance, in conjunction with the Victorian government, has created community resources on climate mitigation and adaptation, and it's free, noplanetnoplay.org. Highly recommend you guys move towards that if you need, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Sheila. That was great. And feel free to share some of those resources in the chat too. Okay, let's move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is John Coulter. John is a part-time project officer for the Gippsland Community Power Hub and for the Energy Innovation Cooperative. He's a sustainability consultant with over 12 years of experience guiding renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. He's lived in Gippsland for 21 years and knows the negative impacts disruption of energy supply has on safety of local communities and how transitioning to clean energy can change this. John has a strong interest in community renewable energy and energy efficiency for new and retrofitted houses and buildings. He also works with community groups to fund renewable energy projects via the Energy Innovation Co-op's Core Fund, which is a tax-deductible fund providing no interest loans to community groups to reduce energy costs. John's achievements include project manager of the Old Energy, New Energy solar and battery installation at the State Coal Mine in Wonthaggi, energy audits, a graduate certificate of sustainability from Swinburne University, and he was part of the Bass Coast Climate Change Plan Community Reference Group in 2020 and a board member of the Energy Innovation Cooperative from 2015 to 2017. So I'm going to hand it over to John now. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Tammy, and good evening, everybody. I just have to get my screen to share as well, so I can talk to that. I just want to give you a brief overview of the Gippsland Community Power Hub. This is a partnership of 3 organisations: the Gippsland Climate Change Network in the Latrobe Valley, the Energy Innovation Co-op in South Gippsland, and the Mallacoota Sustainable Energy Group in East Gippsland. So we've got all of Gippsland covered. All these groups are not for profit, mostly volunteer run, and are passionate about what we do. So we have a lot in common with local sporting groups. I'm just getting my screen to move on now. Trying to. There we go. Our Power Hub is one of 7 across Victoria, funded through Sustainability Victoria until June next year. We're here to support community groups with their renewable energy plans, and if you don't have a plan, we can help create one. And we've hit the ground running. When the hub funding was announced, we had some shovel-ready projects, as they call them, which were received implementation. This is one of them here. This is at the Coronet Bay Community Hall, which now has an 11.5 kilowatt solar system installed. Lucknow Rec Reserve has extra batteries now to store and use power from their 20 kilowatt solar system. The Venus Bay Community Centre is having, as we speak almost, solar and batteries installed to help it become a resilience centre for before and after emergency events or during power outages, of which we've had a few recently. The hub partners also obtained funding from other sources for the Bass Rec Reserve, Granville Hall, and Daleston Football Netball Club. Clubs use a lot more energy now than when this photo was taken in 1910 of the premiership team at Daleston Football Netball Club. Energy savings from all these projects adds up to tens of thousands of dollars a year, and that's money that now stays in the community. And that's where the Gippsland Power Hub can help sporting groups. We can help develop projects and get them shovel ready. We don't have capital funding, but we stay up to date on current grants. And this project, this is at Daleston, just before the installation. This was funded with a New Energy Jobs Fund grant, which is why Jordan Cronali on the right there, the local state member for Bass, is in the photo. And she's a soccer player rather than a football or netball player. There is also 2 local funds, the Southern Core Fund and Energise Gippsland, that can lend funds out at no interest or low interest to community groups or businesses to install renewables. The loans repaid from savings on the electricity bills. Donations to these groups are tax deductible, so if you know any local philanthropists, please let them know. If your group has a project, then what's next? So one of the things is to have a chat to Tammy or to one of our other community engagement officers, and they can help you put together a proposal, look at funding options, and look at the best way forward. Often one of the things as project officers we do is look at this not very interesting smart meter and obtain the interval data from it. That could be used to put into Victorian Energy Compare, which is very worthwhile. It's run by the state government, so they don't sell you anything. But often I find that sporting groups or businesses aren't on the best retail offers, and often you can save quite a lot of money just by changing to a different retailer. Getting an energy audit can also help to compare, prioritise the best option. So this is an example. This is the My Home Energy on AusNet that you can look at your energy consumption for free once you register. This particular one, you can see the solar output down the bottom of the graph there. But the advantage of audits, energy audits, is that it may be that replacing a hot water system or changing the lights can sometimes save you more money than installing solar panels. So reducing energy is always great, and then you can still install solar panels or batteries. And okay, so there's lots of free tools around to help save on costs. The Power Hub is here to help, not necessarily to do it for you, but to help manage energy costs and to keep that money in the community where it belongs. Thanks for listening, and back to you, Tammy.
Thank you, John. Okay, so our next presenter is going to be someone who can talk in a little bit more detail about their projects. And that is Andy Thomas. My slide is going to move on for me. There we go. So I'll just introduce Andy. So Andy has been president of the Darlston Football Netball Club for 4 years. He and his wife, Diana, have been involved with Darlston Football Netball Club for 20 years. And Andy says being involved at the Darlston Football Netball Club is very satisfying but hard work, especially in COVID times. The club has been on a building rejuvenation journey for the last 4 years with new social and change rooms, new netball courts and change rooms, and new training lights due to be completed this coming season. Andy believes sport and community are a vital mix in the wellbeing of our youth, especially now for our kids coping after the isolation of COVID lockdowns. So over to you now, Andy.
Thanks, Tammy. Great to be here. I suppose from a footy club point of view, all our process started at the beginning of COVID. We were not playing any games. We had no income coming in because there was no canteens, there was no gate, there was no anything that we wanted to do to raise money to pay all the bills. Nothing was coming in. But all our energy bills were still coming in, and we were finding that they were continuing to go up all the time. We were at our ground, we were being charged 2 supply charges as well. And we were really concerned about where our club's future was going to be if we were going to continue on this path where it was, over $1,000 a month that we were forking out for our power bills. So we contacted John at the Energy Innovation Co-op, and he was really helpful in understanding what our problems were. And the first thing that he suggested was we get an energy audit done. And so we had that done, and a lot of the things that we needed to do, like we were switching off. At the time, we had freezers that were still on and fridges that were on, and we weren't smart in the way that we were managing our energy. And after the audit, we found that by switching off a fridge here and there, and making sure that we had perhaps solar lights and switches in our rooms, that the lights weren't on all the time. These things were going to save a lot of money for us. We were lucky enough to get a grant through the Energy Co-op, and we've installed the solar panels on our rooms, and it's made an enormous difference to some of the bills for us. This time last year, we had a bill for $932, and a bill this year, even though we had the rooms open more and there were more use of power, was down to $600. Now we feel we can get that down even further, and just by being smart with the way that we look after our energy, and it's we think that there's a good chance that our club can save so much more money and has so many more opportunities to grow the football club continuing. We've had new netball rooms in the last 12 months as well. We'll be looking at trying to get solar panels on them in the future. I'm sorry about the lights flashing behind there. Something to do with us saving too much energy, I think. There's so many other ways that we think that we can save money, and it's just one of those things that we feel that it's important for the community as well. Our club wants to be seen as being progressive. It wants to be seen as in touch with what the majority of people want for our planet. We think that being energy conscious with solar is going to be the future for our club, and it'll save a lot in money, and it makes us look like we're going with the times, that we're a smart, progressive place to be. And, you know, I couldn't thank the Energy Innovation Co-op anymore, and John and his team for all their support that they've given us. Yeah, that's probably about it, I think.
Thanks for that, Andy. I just want to remind everyone, if you've got any questions, just to pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them after our final speaker, who is Benita. So I'll just do an introduction for Benita. So Benita has been at Bass Coast Shire Council in the role of Climate Change and Sustainability Advisor since May 2019, after 10 years working with Western Port Water. Key projects during her time at Western Port Water included the introduction of Class A recycled water on Phillip Island, the expansion of the Kandowie Reservoir and associated revegetation in surrounding catchment through partnership with Landcare, and the development of Western Port Water's climate change strategy and emissions reduction pledge. The declaration of a climate emergency in 2019 by Bass Coast Shire Council after community pressure demanded a rethink of climate policy and strategy, resulting in Benita managing the development of the Bass Coast Climate Change Action Plan. The plan development engaged with over 580 Bass Coast community members, whose ongoing passion and input into the climate emergency response inspires Benita in her daily role. So I'm going to hand it over to Benita now. Thanks, Benita.
Thanks, Tammy, and thanks, Andy, for. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, great. And thanks, Andy, for giving us a bit of a rundown of what's happening at Darleston. It's really great to see the leadership in Bass Coast from our sporting clubs. So I'm not going to talk too much. I've got a video that I can share, and I might just talk about a couple of Bass Coast grants that are available for climate change. So I'm just going to share this screen with you, make sure I've got my sound on, and let this tell you about our climate.
We acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as the first Australians and recognise that they have a unique relationship with the land and water. The Bass Coast is blessed with rich agricultural land, strong business and happy communities. But our land is facing a crisis like no other. In 2019, Bass Coast Shire councillors declared a climate emergency, recognising that urgent action is required to combat climate change and the serious risks it poses to our entire community. The Climate Change Action Plan will guide our community to net zero emissions by 2030. Using evidence-based and scientifically supported methodology, households, businesses and agriculture can work together with Council to reduce emissions and prepare for a changing future. Already we're seeing the impact of climate change in the Bass Coast, from foreshore erosion to extreme storm events and the increased risk of bushfires. We've identified 5 key climate change hazards that will negatively impact our health, the environment and the economy in the Bass Coast. Some impacts are obvious, such as heat damage to infrastructure, blackouts and water shortage, but many are much less obvious but equally impactful. For instance, extreme weather compounds mental health problems and increases stress on health and emergency services. The first part of reducing emissions is understanding where they come from. In the Bass Coast, we create over 700,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions each year. That's about 18 tonnes per person. 44% of our emissions come from residential households, 33% from farming and agriculture, and 23% from businesses both commercial and industrial. Some of the highest individual contributors are cattle, transportation, industrial processes, and household hot water and appliances. These contributors provide our greatest opportunities to reduce emissions and decarbonise our community. Fortunately, we've identified that we can reduce to net zero by implementing a range of recommendations. In households, businesses and agriculture, there are steps each of us can take. Our climate change action plan is twofold. Firstly, we reduce emissions to net zero. Secondly, we'll help our communities accept and adapt to the inevitable changes that climate change will bring. There are many actions that households, businesses and agricultural communities can take to reduce emissions. We can install solar systems, update to electric vehicles, plant more trees, update appliances to low emission options, and change our lifestyles and work practices to become more sustainable. As we approach 2030, we also expect to see greater levels of utility-grade wind and solar as energy companies replace fossil fuels with renewables. Everyone's situation is different. You may not have capacity to make changes today, but you can start planning for the future. Even if we reduce carbon emissions to net zero, some climate change is inevitable. So how do we prepare for the changes we know are coming? First, by connecting with others. Joining local community groups and local businesses collaborating with one another will create a more resilient community. By assessing the risks posed by extreme weather conditions, we can adapt our businesses and households. Gardening and planting trees on a small or large scale cools our properties and protects our land and livestock. And by changing what species we farm to be more diverse and drought tolerant. These changes, among others, will help us create a resilient and connected Bass Coast. The Council has already begun a range of actions, and we're proud to say our own emissions are moving closer to zero. Over the next 10 years, we'll continue assisting the community on our journey to net zero. There's no single solution to climate change. It's the many little changes in our lives that contribute to the whole. We must act now to protect our natural assets, maintain our unique environment, and secure a resilient, prosperous future for our community. We each have a role to play, and there's steps each one of us can take depending on our own unique circumstances. Working together, we can reach net zero and mitigate the impacts of climate change whilst building a resilient Bass Coast.
Thanks, everyone. So that's just a quick That's just a really quick summary of a very big document that I've sort of got here that covers both the community and council. As it's said in there, there is an action in our climate change action plan where we will provide funding for community groups for climate action, and that includes solar and batteries and energy efficiency for community groups, including sporting clubs. And there is currently a round open, and I'll put the link in the chat in a second, but the community grants up to $10,000 for a major grant, and we have another $10,000 available for minor grants up to $5,000. So we actually did support two sporting clubs in the last round that was announced. So the next round closes in March next year. So if you're in Bass Coast, have a look at those grants and see how you go. And please ask me any questions if you have them as well. And that's me, Tammy.
Thanks for that, Benita. I might get all of you to turn your cameras on now, and we'll just make sure nobody else has any questions. Well, we just wait and see if there's any. I've got one for you, I think, Sheila. So I'm just thinking, after hearing from John about how critical the environment is, do you have any suggestions about how to engage sporting clubs better? For example, we would have hoped for a better uptake and some more participants here tonight. So do you have any suggestions for how we might be able to engage better with sporting clubs to get the message across?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways you can do it. One is you've got some likely ambassadors already, like Andy, for example, who's already in the network. You could talk to other CEOs and presidents of clubs that are in sport, but as well as sport officers. It's very interesting. We work with a lot of councils where environment stays with environment and sport stays in sport. But if you speak to the sport people and say, hey, environment does affect you, then conversations start happening. And maybe Benita has that experience between departments, and they go, oh, we can do plastic free, or oh, emissions reduction, and all these other things. So I think once that occurs, then it starts to snowball a bit. But Andy, like, your story was really great. I love listening to it. Just your thought process around like what motivated you to go, what the hell of my bills, and then, you know, seek out some support.
Yeah. And Andy, I'm actually wondering too if you came across any particular barriers within your community, within your club, that you had to overcome, like with that community. Did you have to talk them around to getting solar panels?
Oh no, there was no barriers at all. You know, like the community were 100% behind it, because they realised that the power bills were just getting out of control. Like, and you know, you want to be seen as doing the right thing for the planet, and that you don't want to be that one that sits back and does nothing about it. You know, we really value all the help that we've had, and you know, hopefully it continues on, that we can continue to lower the bills that we've been getting, and you know, that makes it easier for clubs to survive. Like in these COVID times, it's pretty tough for you know, all sporting clubs, and you know, power bills, water bills, all that sort of stuff is things that you can't control, and you know, you just have to do your best to try and reduce costs somehow.
Okay. And Benita, Bass Coast Council is the only one in Gippsland that has declared a climate emergency. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, in 2019, we declared a climate emergency in response to over 1,000 community members signing a petition. And so for those that aren't really aware what a climate emergency means, what it means for Bass Coast is that we needed to relook at the actions that we were already taking in terms of our climate change response, and accelerate those at a speed and scale that was beyond what we were doing already. So we already had some climate change plans in place, quite a progressive council, but the acknowledgement was that what we were doing wasn't enough. And so the climate change action plan that we have outlines a lot of really sort of important but not so shiny actions in there around how do we actually embed the climate emergency into the whole organisation, so that from every role in the organisation understands, they rethink the way that they operate and embed that climate change thinking. So I'm trying to think of an example we're working through, but what our guys were just recently out the girls and guys out the back in our infrastructure maintenance team have just bought an electric bike for them to do their inspections along the rail trails. So it's a really simple one. The guys are thinking it, and they're taking action. It means that they're not driving their car back out into the road into the next point where the rail trail crosses over, parking it. They actually just drive all the way along the rail trail to do all their inspections. So really simple stuff, but really thinking from lots of different angles around how the climate emergency can be embedded into council. I just noticed there was a question from Michelle, so I was just wondering whether I could just address that before the end, if I've got a quick time. She asked about aquatic facilities. I know that those people that are in Latrobe would be aware of the work that's been done at the Traralgon Aquatic Centre in the design and development of the feasibility studies for Bass Coast. We've looked at geothermal heating for both of the sites, as well as looking at renewable energy options for those as well. So quite a lot of work happening in there, but no gas as a solution for those. So we'll be able to do that sort of transition to renewable. I hope that answers your question, Michelle.
Great. And a question for John Clark, just thinking about in terms of indoor and outdoor sports, do you think there's one of those in particular would be more impacted by climate change in the future? Do you think outdoor sports are likely to move perhaps indoors, or and maybe Sheila, you might be able to contribute to this answer as well?
Yeah, thanks, Tammy. There's a range of adaptation options available to people, but in general, yeah, if you're playing outdoors in summer, it's going to get harder, and moving to an indoor cooled space is an obvious solution, but of course that has costs too. So if it's going to be air conditioned, that has costs, and also you have to think about the carbon footprint of that too. There may be behavioural changes that can be made But I think the key thing is that some of, as we've heard already, some of these changes are locked in. There are changes that we can't get away from, and they're really the changes around the 2030s, 2040s. That's going to happen. Beyond that, though, the actions that we take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions really matter, and the local action is a key factor in getting there.
I think I might just add into what John said is that I think the important thing is that sport is planning with the understanding that things are changing, and that, as John already said, there are some adaptation mechanisms and actions that they can take. And I know, just as an aside, an anecdote, in November of 2019, we held a climate scenario planning session. And in that, for 4 hours, and in that, the sports were like, oh, you know, one of the responses to these scenarios could be we might not play in front of a crowd. And everyone was laughing about it. And then 4 months later, COVID hit. And of course, we didn't get to play in front of crowds for, you know, what is also climate related challenge, which is zoonotic disease and COVID. So it's really fascinating. So the point here is I give the advice to plan with the evidence that, say, CSIRO is already forecasting reliably.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I might finish off with one final question for John Coulter. About, John, do you have a one final message, a key message for sports clubs to take away about how they can get involved with us, or how to get started in something like this?
I think it's taking the lead from people like Andy involved in the clubs. It's just sort of putting out feelers in the community and inviting people to get in touch with the hub, because we've got until June next year to try to get a whole lot of projects in the pipeline. And then it's surprising, sometimes we can find some funding money here or there, or loans or whatever it is, but the spreading the word just across the sports community, really, about that there's some options out there, and it saves money, but also helps save the planet.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everyone for coming along tonight. We didn't go too far over time, only about 8 minutes or so. I hope you've got a lot out of tonight's session. I definitely have. Thanks for bearing with me in the start there. Yeah, we'll hopefully see you all again soon. If the speakers want to hang around for a little bit, we might keep talking. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.